So today I'm going to do a complete teardown of a Garcia 5500C. I'm just basically going to tear this reel down, lay it out, put it back together. So if you want to attempt to work on your own reel and you have this particular model, you'll have something to go by. So let's get started. So we got 3 screws on the left side plate. We got thumb screws on the right side. I'm going to go ahead and start with the frame. So I've done several other videos that talks about this process. I'm still going to break it down, show you how it's done. Got the cap and the pawl. We're going to pull this shim out. Then this thing's just going to fall apart. Worm drive's going to come out, the guard, and the line guide. Once you get everything cleaned up and we're ready to put it back together, we're going to take the guide, put it through, put the line guide on, get it locked into place. Put the worm drive in, take your shim, the 2 little feet go on the bottom, put that in place. Put the pawl back in. At this point, you need to work things back and forth, make sure the pawl gets seated. Put the cap back on. That's good to go. Set that over to the side. We'll talk about the left side plate. On these reels, you have a screw that holds in the cog. Simply take that out. The cog comes out. Get everything cleaned up. Get ready to put it back together. That goes back in. So one of the major differences with this particular reel is the bearings are in the end caps, not on the spool. You got the brake plates right here. I did a complete video on brake plates. Check that out. It'll talk about care and function of the brakes. Another difference is the bearings are rounded. They are not flat like in a standard CS rocket. So the bearing goes in. I'm not sure exactly what this piece is called. It basically holds the bearing in place. It's a tensioner. Then the cap just goes back on. When you put these things back together, make sure you back off on this cap 2 or 3 turns so that you don't force the reel back together. You can always adjust it back in as needed. So we'll get into the right side. This is an upgraded handle. It is not the stock handle. 10mm wrench. Another difference of the 5500C and newer models is you have a screw here, not a C-clip. Star drag's just going to spin off. It's your tensioner for the handle. Right here you got your anti-reverse dog. If I start winding this thing, it's going to want to float out on me. Once you get it seated back in, you cannot turn it backwards. So we'll go ahead and pull the gear off. The anti-reverse dog kind of comes with it, and the best thing to do is to put it back on there. It helps you get it seated correctly. There is a small brass shim on this drive shaft. It may come off when you pull the gears out and be stuck to the bottom side. The one thing I'm not crazy about when it comes to this particular reel is all these mechanisms are actually riveted into the plate. You cannot remove them. You can remove the springs. It makes it a lot easier to clean this thing. To get the gear out, you need to engage the plunger. At that point, you can pull this out. Get it cleaned up, grease it up, put it back in. There's a small plastic shim here that rides on this shaft. You can pop it out and remove it. Just be careful. These things are old. They could be brittle. If you can clean it without removing it, I would suggest that. So at this point, the best you can do is just to get in there with some pipe cleaners, Q-tips, anything you can use to clean it up. Re-grease it, put it back together. So this mechanism right here will actually swing out. Makes it a little easier to clean. This one also moves, but it's not going to come out as far. To get the gear back in, you can put a screwdriver underneath. It's spring-loaded. Makes it real easy to get it out and in. Slide it back in. So I got all three of the springs back on. Everything's cleaned up, greased up, ready to go. We'll go ahead and disassemble the drag stack. I'm going to pull that out. This is a bushing. Does not have an anti-reverse bearing, and there is a brass shim underneath it. Washer underneath that. When I put this thing back together, I'll put the washer on first. It's cupped upwards. Then I'll put this other flat washer on, then the bushing. We'll go ahead and pull the gear off. This is a fairly simple system. You have one drag washer. Rides inside the gear. You have another drag washer underneath the gear. If you watch any of my other videos, I always put drag grease on my washers. So we'll go ahead and put everything back together. I'm going to put the drag washer back in. As we put this thing back together, I just want to stop for a second and talk about drag washers. If you're going to spend time working on your fishing reels, if you're going to take it apart, you might as well upgrade to some carbon fiber drag washers. This reel is really, really old. It's a 5500C, but I got carbon fiber in it. It just doesn't get any better than that. So I just want to encourage you guys to consider that when you're working on your own fishing reels. Put a little shim back on the drive shaft. So a lot of times when I'm dealing with these anti-reverse dogs, I'll actually slide them on to this gear. It'll hold itself in place. It kind of looks like that. Slide this onto the shaft and then turn this until I kind of get it lined up with this post right here. And I'm going to have to adjust it a little bit, and then it should seat. All right, that looks good. I'm going to set that over to the side for a second, and we're going to pull this cap off right here. This cap has a shim in it. I typically take those out, put some grease on them. There's a little brass cover here for the bearing. I'm going to flip that over. It'll come out. Then you have your bearing underneath. Again, these bearings have a rounded edge on them. Because these bearings are oval on the outside edge, they will have a tendency to wobble on you a little bit, so make sure you get them in there flat. Put the cover back on and the cap. Again, I'm going to back off on that 2 or 3 turns. So let's go ahead and put this thing back together. 2 things I want to mention real quick is you have this little anti-reverse dog that could get outside and restrict the cap from going back on. Also, you have the little notch that's got to fit over the handle. So make sure your little dog's tight up inside everything. Once you get that star drag down a little bit, I'm going to put the handle on so I can tighten it a little bit more. Because I kind of want to get it engaged so that when I do tighten the handle down, I have room. Tensioner, handle, and screw. Talked about this on other videos. Once this nut gets snugged, you need to put your lock washer on. You can see I need it a little bit tighter to get it around. So I'm going to pull that back off. Tighten that up a little bit more till I get that lined up. So that's perfect. At this point, I'll go ahead and back the drag off. Make sure the cap's not too tight. Looks good. Left side plate. So guys, don't fram down on these screws. Get them good and snug, but it is not a strong man's contest. So I talked earlier about backing off on the spool caps. The reason we do this is when we put it back together, we don't want to force this thing against the axle. Once it's back together, you'll adjust each spool cap a little bit at a time until you get the correct amount of play in the spool. You'll know when you got it right. So that's a wrap. As always, any support would be greatly appreciated. Happy fishing to you. See you next time.